The Georgia sun burned mercilessly overhead, turning the air thick with the stench of decay. From shallow pits in the earth rose the smell of unwashed bodies, human waste, and death itself. Flies swarmed, dogs barked in the distance, and the weak moans of starving men drifted through the wooden stockade. This was not a battlefield, nor a graveyard, though it was both in spirit. It was Andersonville, the most infamous prison camp of the Confederacy, where more than 40,000 Union soldiers were once confined. Among them were free black men, soldiers who had taken up the Union's blue uniform, fighting not only to preserve the nation, but to end the very institution of slavery. Yet here, within the rotting fences, their struggle for freedom twisted into a cruel paradox. The camp was officially called Camp Sumter, a name that sounded almost noble, but what lay inside was anything but. A crude stockade of pine logs enclosed 26 acres of bare earth with no shelters provided. Prisoners dug holes in the ground for shade or draped ragged blankets across sticks, creating flimsy tents that collapsed in the rain. Water came from a small stream called Stockade Branch, which cut through the camp like a curse. Upstream, Confederate guards used it as their latrine. By the time the trickle reached the prisoners, it was already fouled with filth, spreading dysentery, typhoid, and cholera. Men drank it anyway, because thirst was more immediate than fear of disease. Everywhere one looked were bones and rags, men so starved their skin clung to their ribs, their eyes hollow, their bodies covered in sores. They called it the deadline, a simple fence marking the boundary inside the stockade. Any man who crossed it, even by accident, would be shot without hesitation by guards perched in watchtowers above. The threat kept the living penned in like cattle awaiting slaughter. For white Union soldiers, Andersonville was already hell. But for black soldiers captured on the battlefield, it was a deeper abyss. The Confederacy never recognized them as legitimate combatants. To the Southern mind, these men were runaways, rebels against their natural place, and thus not deserving of the rights of prisoners of war. Some were executed on the spot after capture. Others were sold into slavery, disappearing into plantations where their Union uniforms became rags of shame. Those who survived long enough to be sent to Andersonville faced double torment, mocked, beaten, starved, and often forced to labor under harsher conditions than their white counterparts. Their blue coats, once symbols of defiance, made them targets within the walls of the camp. The commandant of Andersonville was Captain Henry Wirz, a Swiss-born officer who became infamous for his cruelty and indifference. He walked through the camp with a riding crop in hand, his eyes cold, his accent sharp as he barked orders. Prisoners feared him as much as they despised him, for under his rule, death became routine, and mercy was a word without meaning. The Confederacy claimed shortages were to blame for the conditions. Food was scarce across the South, they argued, so why should Yankee prisoners expect better? Yet, even in those hungry times, the guards received rations of bread and meat, while the men inside the stockade gnawed at handfuls of uncooked cornmeal. Malnutrition hollowed their faces and bloated their bellies. Disease moved faster than bullets. Dysentery swept through the rows of makeshift shelters, leaving men curled in the dirt, too weak to crawl away from their own filth. Smallpox spread from body to body, erupting in sores that would not heal. The so-called hospital was little more than a pen within the stockade, where men lay side by side on the ground, waiting to die. Every morning, the dead cart rolled through the gates, pulled by prisoners too weak to walk steadily. They collected corpses that had stiffened overnight, tossing them into piles as though they were firewood. By evening, the bodies were dumped into shallow trenches outside the walls, where they were covered with a thin layer of earth that the rain often washed away. For the black prisoners, even the act of dying carried a heavier weight. Their comrades whispered that Confederates took less care in burying them, often tossing their bodies in unmarked pits. To many Southerners, these men were not soldiers at all, but fugitives whose deaths required no dignity. It was another theft of humanity in a place already stripped bare of it. Some prisoners clung to hope through faith, gathering in ragged circles to sing hymns that drifted weakly into the night air. The voices cracked with thirst and hunger, but the words carried a strength that even the guards could not silence. For black prisoners especially, the songs of freedom and deliverance were a reminder that their suffering was not without meaning. Others tried to escape the misery by tunneling beneath the stockade walls. They dug with spoons, bits of wood, even bare hands, pushing the soil beneath their blankets to avoid detection. A few tunnels reached the outer edge, but most collapsed, and those caught faced brutal punishment. For black soldiers, capture often meant execution or a beating so savage it left them crippled. Within the camp, hierarchy emerged. Bands of desperate men known as raiders preyed upon the weak, stealing what little food or clothing they had. The guards did nothing to stop it. Justice, when it came, was brutal and swift. The prisoners themselves rose against the raiders, capturing them and holding a makeshift trial. Several were hanged inside the stockade, the crowd watching with hollow eyes. As the months dragged on, the population swelled far beyond the camp's capacity. Designed for 10,000 men, Andersonville held more than 30,000 at its peak. The ground became a mire of mud and filth, with no clean place to rest. Black soldiers were pushed to the margins, often given the least shelter and the most dangerous positions near the foul stream. Rumors of exchange brought fleeting moments of hope. Prisoners whispered that a deal was coming, that soon they would be freed. But the negotiations stalled again and again. For black soldiers, the news was worse. Confederate leaders openly declared they would never trade Negro troops as equals. Freedom for them, if it came at all, would not be through exchange but through survival. By late summer of 1864, Andersonville was a vision of apocalypse. The stockade groaned under the weight of its captives, men packed so tightly they could hardly stretch their legs at night. The sun scorched the bare earth by day, while sudden storms turned the camp into a swamp of mud and disease. Hunger hollowed every face until each man looked like a walking corpse. Black prisoners endured insults, hurled not only by the guards, but sometimes by fellow captives. The racism of the outside world seeped through the stockade walls, poisoning even those who shared the same misery. Yet bonds still formed. White soldiers who once doubted their black comrades began to see their courage in enduring the same horrors, shoulder to shoulder in the filth. In August, a strange event gave the dying men a glimmer of hope. After weeks of prayer, a sudden thunderstorm unleashed a torrent of rain. Lightning struck inside the stockade, opening a spring of fresh water that flowed clear and cold into the prison yard. Prisoners called it Providence Spring, believing it was a miracle. For a time, they drank deeply, their cracked lips and swollen throats soothed by the gift of clean water. But miracles could not stop death. By the time Union forces finally pushed deeper into the South, nearly 13,000 men had perished at Andersonville. For the black soldiers, survival was even more unlikely, their names often lost in unmarked graves. They had entered the war as free men, ready to fight for liberty, only to die in chains they thought they had left behind. When liberation finally came in 1865, the sight that greeted Union troops was beyond imagination. The emaciated figures who stumbled out of the gates barely resembled soldiers. Bones protruded through skin, eyes stared without focus, and many could not even walk without being carried. Andersonville became a word whispered with horror, a symbol of cruelty that no victory could erase. Captain Henry Wirz did not escape judgment. In November 1865, he was brought before a military tribunal in Washington, accused of war crimes for the misery and mass death under his command. Survivors of Andersonville, gaunt and haunted, took the stand to tell of starvation, disease, beatings, and the infamous deadline that turned hesitation into execution. Their voices cracked, but their words painted a portrait of a man who had ruled hell. Wirz defended himself, insisting he had only followed orders, that shortages of food and medicine were beyond his control. Yet evidence showed his cruelty was personal. Prisoners recalled him striking the weak with his whip, or watching with cold indifference as men gasped their last breaths. For the black soldiers, there was no doubt. His contempt for their very existence sealed their fate long before hunger or fever did. The tribunal found him guilty, and Henry Wirz was hanged on November 10, 1865. As the trapdoor opened beneath his feet, some survivors felt a grim satisfaction, but others knew that no single execution could balance the scale of suffering. Andersonville was not just the creation of one man, but the embodiment of a nation divided, poisoned by hatred, and blind to the humanity of those it enslaved or despised. For years after the war, families came to the cemetery outside the prison walls, searching for names among the thousands of crude wooden markers. White soldiers were remembered in official records, while many black soldiers remained anonymous, buried without inscriptions, their sacrifice swallowed by silence. The United States, still struggling with Reconstruction, carried forward the wound of Andersonville as both a warning and a shame. Yet the memory of those who endured, their songs, their courage, their refusal to surrender their humanity, did not vanish. Andersonville became a monument, a national cemetery where the dead lay together, silent but not forgotten. In the whispers of history, the voices of the black soldiers still rise, men who fought for freedom only to be cast into a pit of cruelty, and whose suffering reminds us that liberty has always been paid for in blood. In the decades that followed, Andersonville lingered like a ghost on the national conscience. Veterans groups told and retold their stories, each account etched with horror. Newspapers published engravings of skeletal prisoners, their hollow eyes staring back at the public, demanding that the world never forget. For many Americans, the name alone conjured an image of human suffering beyond comprehension, but memory was uneven. White survivors often became spokesmen for the tragedy, their words carried into books, speeches, and commemorations. Black survivors, fewer in number and less likely to be heard, struggled to have their suffering recognized. Some spoke quietly in church gatherings, telling of comrades who had been whipped or sold back into bondage, but their testimonies rarely made it into print. The cemetery at Andersonville grew into sacred ground. Row after row of headstones lined the fields, stretching as far as the eye could see. Visitors walked among them in silence, reading names, dates, and regiment numbers. Yet many stones bore only a number or the word unknown. Behind those anonymous markers lay stories that would never be told, especially the lives of black soldiers whose identities were erased even in death. By the late 19th century, Andersonville had become a rallying cry for veterans organizations. They demanded pensions, recognition, and monuments. At the same time, Southern voices tried to soften or excuse the atrocity, framing Wirz as a scapegoat of Northern vengeance. Monuments to Confederate dead rose across the South, while Andersonville's black victims remained largely absent from the memorial landscape. Still, whispers of their courage persisted. Families of the fallen kept oral traditions alive, telling children about uncles, fathers, and brothers who had gone to war wearing Union blue, only to vanish into the horror of Andersonville. These stories carried the memory forward when official histories turned their gaze elsewhere. Through the early 20th century, Andersonville became both a place of pilgrimage and a battlefield of memory. Veterans returned in dwindling numbers, their hair white, their steps unsteady, but their eyes still drawn to the rows of graves. Some wept openly, others stood in silence, remembering comrades who had wasted away behind the walls. Their presence kept the story alive, even as the broader nation began to forget. For black communities, remembrance was quieter, carried through sermons and family lore. Ministers invoked the suffering of black soldiers at Andersonville as proof of their people's sacrifice in the struggle for freedom. In small towns across the South, mothers and grandmothers told children about unmarked graves and the courage of men who had chosen to fight rather than accept chains. These stories, though rarely written down, became part of an underground archive of resistance. The prison site itself decayed. Wooden stockade walls collapsed, swallowed by weeds and time. The earth shifted over trenches where thousands lay buried, yet the power of the place remained. Visitors described an oppressive silence, as if the land still carried the echoes of groans, hymns, and the crack of rifles at the deadline. Andersonville was not just history, it was a scar carved into the soil. By mid-century, the memory of Andersonville was pulled into new struggles. As civil rights activists demanded equality, they pointed to the sacrifices of black Union soldiers, including those who had suffered in Confederate prisons. Their blood had consecrated the ground, activists argued, and the nation owed them recognition not only in death, but in life. The legacy of Andersonville became ammunition in a broader battle for justice. Still, official commemoration lagged. National ceremonies focused on unity, reconciliation, and the valor of soldiers in general. The particular pain of black captives remained at the margins, their stories diluted by narratives of shared sacrifice. Only later would historians begin to recover their voices, piecing together fragments of testimony to reveal how deeply racism shaped every corner of Andersonville's cruelty. By the late 20th century, Andersonville was transformed from a decaying ruin into a preserved National Historic Site. The cemetery became a place of ceremony on Memorial Day, rows of white headstones gleaming under the Georgia sun. Tourists walked the grounds, guided by plaques and reconstructed stockade walls, trying to imagine the horror that had once consumed this quiet field. Yet imagination often fell short. The grass was green, the air calm, the silence broken only by birdsong. It was difficult for visitors to picture the mud, the stench, the cries of men wasting away. To bridge that gap, survivors' testimonies were etched into stone and displayed in museums, their words giving voice to the silence. "I saw men die every day," one wrote. "I saw them carried out like logs." For African American visitors, the site carried a deeper, often unspoken weight. They walked among the graves, knowing that many of their ancestors had fought in Union blue and died here nameless. Some found comfort in the shared landscape of sacrifice, while others felt the sting of absence, the reminder that official memory had long excluded black suffering. Andersonville was both a place of mourning and a challenge to history itself. In classrooms and history books, the prison camp became shorthand for Civil War cruelty, but details about black soldiers remained scarce. Teachers spoke of starvation and disease, of Henry Wirz in the tribunal, but rarely of the men whose very status as soldiers was denied. To restore their presence required painstaking research. Letters, pension files, oral traditions pieced together like fragments of bone from the earth. Today, Andersonville stands not only as a cemetery but as a museum of prisoners of war from all American conflicts. The stories of Civil War captives are told alongside those of later generations, linking past and present. Yet beneath that broad narrative, the soil still remembers the particular agony of 1864, when black men who had taken up arms for freedom found themselves condemned once more to chains, disease, and silence. Even in the present day, Andersonville remains a place where silence speaks louder than words. Visitors walk the cemetery's rows, reading names carved into stone, yet pausing longest before the markers labeled unknown. Beneath those headstones lie countless black soldiers whose identities were erased twice, first by slavery's shadow and then by neglect in official memory. Some descendants come searching for fragments. They hold faded letters, pension applications, or family stories that hint at a great-grandfather who fought, was captured, and never returned. Standing before the graves, they whisper prayers or leave flowers, gestures of recognition that history denied. In their voices, the dead are called back to belonging. Historians continue to uncover records that shed light on the black prisoners of Andersonville. Muster rolls, diaries, and testimonies reveal the scope of their ordeal, how they were mocked by guards, pushed to the foulest corners of the camp, denied the small mercies even other prisoners might receive. Each discovery restores a sliver of humanity long buried in the trenches. The site has become a mirror of the nation itself. For some, it represents the cruelty of war and the need to honor all who suffered. For others, it is a reminder of how deeply racism was woven into the fabric of that suffering. Andersonville is not just about death by hunger and disease. It is about the refusal to see certain men as equals even in their dying. And so the story endures, told in whispers, sermons, textbooks, and memorial plaques. It endures in the eyes of visitors who stand in the Georgia heat, trying to feel what it must have been like to wither behind those stockade walls. It endures in the quiet conviction that remembering is an act of justice and forgetting is another form of betrayal. To stand inside the reconstructed stockade today is to feel a fraction of the weight that pressed upon those imprisoned in 1864. The high wooden walls shut out the horizon, leaving only the sky above, the same sky men once stared at while praying for deliverance. The ground beneath is uneven, dotted with markers that trace where the deadline ran, where a single step too far could mean instant death. Visitors sometimes close their eyes, listening for echoes. They imagine the buzz of flies, the rasp of coughing, the shuffle of bare feet across mud. In their minds, they hear the hymns sung in hoarse voices, songs of faith that rose from bodies on the edge of collapse. These were not just cries for survival, but declarations of humanity in a place built to deny it. For the black soldiers trapped there, every hymn carried double meaning. Freedom was not an abstract promise, it was the reason they had picked up rifles, the dream for which they had risked capture. To sing of deliverance inside Andersonville was to defy the Confederacy's claim that they were nothing more than property. Their voices, however weak, rose like banners over the filth. Modern historians argue that Andersonville must be remembered not only as a site of suffering, but as a crucible of resistance. Survival itself was resistance, digging shallow shelters, sharing scraps of food, praying over the dying. Each act affirmed that even in the worst of conditions, humanity could not be wholly crushed. The Confederacy could starve bodies, but it could not extinguish the will to endure. When schoolchildren visit the museum today, they learn not only about Civil War battles, but about what happened behind the lines. Teachers point to the prisoner sketches made at the time, drawings of skeletal men crouched in mud. The lesson is not simply about history. It is about empathy, the need to see the faces of those who suffered and to recognize the cost of hate left unchecked. Each dawn at Andersonville began with the same ritual of despair. The first light revealed bodies stiffened in the night, men who had gone to sleep on bare earth and never awakened. The dead cart creaked through the rows of shelters, its wheels groaning, its stench following in its path. Prisoners too weak to resist lifted the corpses of their comrades, stacking them like cordwood to be hauled away. The living shuffled to the trickle of water, waiting their turn at the foul stream. They cupped muddy handfuls, swallowing filth because thirst left them no choice. Flies swarmed around open sores, and rags hung loose over skeleton frames. Each face was a mask of hunger, each movement a negotiation with pain. The air itself seemed heavy with resignation, yet also with the stubborn will to endure one more day. Black soldiers were often ordered to labor, dragging logs, digging trenches, or clearing waste. Guards shouted at them with the same language once used on plantations, treating their uniforms as a mockery rather than a badge of service. To be forced into such tasks after enlisting to fight for liberty was its own kind of torment. Yet many obeyed, knowing that open defiance could mean a bullet to the chest. Still, within the suffering, moments of solidarity flickered. White soldiers who once doubted their black comrades sometimes shared rations or offered a hand to lift them when they collapsed. In the crucible of Andersonville, prejudice cracked under the pressure of shared misery. Bonds were formed that would outlast the prison walls, friendships forged in the darkest fire. At night, under the pale wash of moonlight, men whispered their hopes. Some spoke of families waiting in the north, of farms and cities they longed to see again. Others prayed for quick death, weary of the endless hunger. For the black soldiers, the dreams often returned to freedom, not only their own, but for all who still lived in bondage. Even in chains, they dreamed of breaking them. As summer dragged on, the camp became a living grave. Heat baked the ground until the dirt cracked like old bone. The smell of decay thickened, clinging to every breath. Men swatted at flies with trembling hands, their arms too frail to drive them away. Each day blurred into the next, measured only by the number of corpses dragged beyond the gates. Disease did not discriminate, yet it carved mercilessly through the weakest. Dysentery hollowed men until they were little more than skin stretched over bone. Scurvy rotted their gums, teeth falling loose as blood pooled in their mouths. Black soldiers, already given the worst corners of the camp, suffered doubly, pressed into filth where infection thrived. Their cries for medicine were met with silence. Food was a cruel joke. Rations arrived sporadically, a handful of cornmeal or rancid meat that stank of rot. Men boiled weeds when they could find them, scraping at the earth for roots. Some swore they could smell bread from the guards' campfires, the scent drifting cruelly over the stockade walls. Hunger was constant, gnawing, an enemy as pitiless as any rifle. And yet, somehow, life clung to life. Prisoners fashioned crude spoons from wood, stitched scraps of cloth into makeshift garments, and carved keepsakes from bone to remind themselves they were still men, not beasts. Black soldiers etched names into scraps of wood, praying that if they did not survive, someone would know they had been here, that they had once stood proud in Union blue. At night, the camp echoed with voices lifted in song. Hymns floated over the stockade, fragile yet unbroken. "Steal away to Jesus," some sang, their voices hoarse, their bodies swaying in rhythm. Others joined with whispered prayers, words rising like smoke into the night sky. In those moments, amid the stink and sorrow, the prisoners reclaimed a fragment of their humanity. As the prisoner count swelled past 30,000, Andersonville collapsed under its own weight. The stream that cut through the camp, once foul, became little more than a trench of filth. Men waded into it despite the stench, cupping brown water into cracked lips, their eyes hollow with desperation. Each sip carried sickness, yet thirst allowed no hesitation. Black soldiers often found themselves driven to the edges of this misery, crowded into the swampiest ground where disease spread fastest. Guards hurled insults as they passed, mocking their blue uniforms, reminding them that in Southern eyes, they were not soldiers at all but runaway slaves. Even in captivity, they were forced to bear the burden of a hatred that clung tighter than chains. Deaths mounted so quickly that digging graves became an endless task. Trenches stretched into the distance, filled each day with rows of bodies laid shoulder to shoulder. A thin layer of dirt was thrown over them, but the rains washed the soil away, exposing bone and cloth. The ground around Andersonville was not earth anymore. It was a vast, open tomb. Rumors whispered through the camp like sparks in the dark. Some said exchanges were coming, that freedom was near. Men clung to the stories with trembling hope, their eyes brightening for a moment before reality sank back in. For black prisoners, the rumors brought little comfort. Confederate leaders had made their position clear. Black troops would never be exchanged as equals. Still, hope lingered stubbornly. Every sunrise was another chance, every bird that soared above the stockade a reminder of the world beyond. And in the dead of night, when prayers and hymns rose together, men dreamed of liberation, not as a distant promise, but as a certainty their souls refused to release. By early 1865, the misery inside Andersonville reached a breaking point. Starvation hollowed the camp to its core. Men staggered like shadows, too weak to stand, collapsing in the dirt where they lay until the dead cart arrived. The cries of the sick blended into a low, constant moan that seemed to seep from the ground itself. Andersonville was no longer a prison. It was a slow-motion massacre. The guards grew numb to the suffering. From their towers, they watched the skeletal figures move below, rifles in hand, eyes cold. Sometimes they laughed at the prisoners' feeble struggles, tossing scraps of food just out of reach like bait. For black soldiers, the mockery was worse, called property, even as they wore the Union's blue. Their presence enraged captors who refused to see them as men. News from outside trickled in on whispers. Sherman's army was cutting through Georgia, burning its way toward the heart of the Confederacy. Each rumor of Union victory sparked hope that deliverance was near. Men clutched those stories like lifelines, repeating them through the night as if speaking freedom aloud could summon it faster. At last, in May of 1865, the gates opened not for another load of prisoners, but for liberation. Union forces marched in to find a vision of horror beyond imagining. Gaunt survivors crawling from holes in the ground, eyes sunken, skin stretched tight over bone. Some cried out, some simply stared, too broken to believe rescue had truly come. For the black soldiers who endured, freedom was bitter and sweet. They stepped out alive, yet many of their comrades had vanished into unmarked graves. The world beyond the stockade was the freedom they had fought for, but it was shadowed by the memory of how easily their lives had been discarded. Liberation could not erase Andersonville. It would remain inside them forever. The moment of liberation carried a silence heavier than gunfire. Union officers walked the grounds in disbelief, covering their mouths against the stench. They had expected hardship, but not this wasteland of bone and shadow. Some soldiers wept openly at the sight of men who looked less like comrades and more like corpses still clinging to breath. Survivors stumbled toward their rescuers, some falling to their knees, others simply staring as though afraid it was only a dream. Voices cracked as they begged for food, for water, for word of home. Doctors rushed in, but even with care, many would not recover. Disease had eaten too deep, starvation too complete. Liberation came too late for thousands who lingered only a few days more. Among the freed were black soldiers, their blue uniforms now nothing but tatters, their faces lined with both pride and anguish. They had endured double scorn, mocked as soldiers, despised as men, but they walked out alive, carrying the memory of those left behind. Some lifted their heads to the sky, whispering prayers of thanks. Others stood in silence, knowing the world would not fully understand what they had endured. The cemetery outside the stockade became their final testimony. Row upon row of graves stretched across the fields, each marker a reminder of lives cut short. White soldiers' names were recorded, but many black soldiers were buried under the word unknown. Their sacrifice was swallowed by the same prejudice that had haunted them in life, a silence that spoke of injustice even in death. Andersonville's survivors bore scars that would never fade. In towns across the North, they told their stories of hunger, of cruelty, of comrades buried in trenches. Yet when black veterans spoke, their voices often faded into the margins, dismissed by those who did not wish to confront the depth of the nation's prejudice. The truth of their suffering lingered like a shadow, waiting for generations to come to finally listen. The nation demanded answers. In the autumn of 1865, Captain Henry Wirz, the commandant of Andersonville, stood before a military tribunal in Washington. The courtroom filled with survivors, gaunt men still bearing the marks of starvation, their hollow eyes fixed on the man they blamed for their torment. The charges were grave: murder, cruelty, and violations of the laws of war. Witness after witness described the nightmare. They spoke of the dead line, where men were shot for stepping too close to the boundary. They told of rations so meager that hunger drove men to gnaw on roots and scraps of bone. Some remembered Wirz himself, whip in hand, striking the weak or turning away when desperate prisoners begged for medicine. His name became synonymous with suffering. Wirz defended himself with defiance. He claimed the shortages were beyond his control, that he was only following orders from above. He painted himself as a scapegoat, chosen to bear the blame for a nation's vengeance. Yet the testimonies were too many, too vivid, too consistent. For the black survivors, his excuses rang hollow. They had felt his contempt more sharply than any shortage of food. The verdict was guilty. On November 10, 1865, Henry Wirz was led to the gallows. A crowd gathered to watch, some demanding silence, others shouting curses. As the trapdoor fell, his body dropped and swung, a single man paying with his life for thousands of deaths. Yet even then, many wondered, was justice truly served, or had one man been punished for the sins of an entire system? For the survivors, the execution did not erase the memories. Nightmares followed them home, visions of the stockade seeping into their sleep. Families embraced them, yet often recoiled at the skeletal figures returned from war. Black veterans faced not only the trauma of Andersonville, but the cold truth that the nation they had fought for still denied them full equality. Freedom had been won, but justice was far from delivered. Reconstruction brought promises, but for many survivors, those promises rang hollow. They returned to a nation struggling to rebuild, yet still divided by color. White veterans of Andersonville were hailed as heroes, their suffering recognized in speeches and monuments. Black veterans, however, often slipped into obscurity, their sacrifices acknowledged only within their own churches and families. Some survivors tried to put the ordeal behind them, turning to farms, workshops, and trades. But the scars of Andersonville were carved too deep. Disease lingered in their bodies: chronic dysentery, weak lungs, crippled joints from malnutrition. Night after night, dreams dragged them back behind the wooden walls, where the smell of death and the cries of the dying would not fade. Families bore the burden too. Wives nursed husbands who could no longer work the fields. Children grew up listening to stories that began with pride and ended in tears. In black households, remembrance was complicated by silence. Speaking of Andersonville meant reopening wounds, yet forgetting meant letting injustice win. Many chose to honor their dead with hymns and whispered prayers, keeping memory alive in the rhythm of worship. The cemetery outside the old prison became sacred ground. Each headstone marked not just a death, but a testimony to endurance. Veterans groups held ceremonies there, draping flags, reciting prayers, vowing never to let the world forget. And yet, the unknown markers, so many of them black, stood as a reminder of how unevenly memory was preserved. Andersonville itself decayed, its stockade rotting back into the earth, its name becoming a warning rather than a place. But among survivors, it remained a presence as sharp as any battlefield wound. To them, it was not simply a prison camp, it was a mirror of a nation's cruelty and its unfinished promise of freedom. As the years passed, Andersonville shifted from a wound of the present into a scar of the past, but its shadow never lifted. Veterans died one by one, their stories fading into family memories and yellowing newspaper clippings. The cemetery grew quiet, the white rows of stone standing like sentinels over the Georgia fields, each one whispering of hunger, disease, and endurance. For Black veterans, the silence weighed heavier. Many had no marked grave, no carved name to testify that they once wore the Union blue. Yet their legacy survived in the strength of their descendants, in the churches that sang freedom songs, and in the scholars who unearthed their forgotten stories. Even when the nation looked away, memory endured, fragile but unbroken. Today, visitors come to Andersonville and walk the paths where thousands once suffered. They stand at the reconstructed stockade and imagine the filth, the cries, the endless moans of dying men. They pause before the word unknown etched into stone, and in that silence, they confront not just the cruelty of war, but the blindness of a society that refused to see every soldier as equal. Andersonville remains both a warning and a vow. It warns of what happens when hatred strips people of humanity, when war becomes an excuse for cruelty. But it also carries a vow, etched in headstones, carried in hymns, that the suffering will not be forgotten. The men who endured, white and black alike, remind us that freedom is never free, and that justice delayed can still be justice demanded. In the stillness of the cemetery, the lesson lingers. The graves stretch out into the horizon, silent yet eloquent. And as long as the wind moves through the Georgia pines, the voices of Andersonville, starved, silenced, but never erased, will continue to speak. If the story of Andersonville has moved you, let it not end here. Share this history so that the voices of those who suffered are not silenced again. Remember the men who endured hunger, disease, and hatred, and honor the Black soldiers whose names were lost to time. Their struggle is part of our shared past, and their memory deserves a place in our future. If you believe these stories must continue to be told, please support this channel by liking this video, subscribing, and sharing it with others who care about uncovering the hidden chapters of history. Together, we can make sure that Andersonville and the countless untold stories like it are never forgotten.